Hello viewers. In this session I shall discuss the module 45. This module deals with the topic demand bias in Heckscher-Ohlin model. In this module we shall discuss the role of demand in Heckscher-Ohlin model. Here we shall observe how the Heckscher-Ohlin model may not hold good based on the basic assumptions of the model due to the demand factor. To overcome this problem, we shall consider two more assumptions as were proposed by Professor Samuelson. After that, we shall discuss some exceptional cases where we shall find that any one of the additional assumption or none of the additional assumption is required to prove the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. In the year 1919, Professor Heckscher, one Swedish economist, first gave the outline of the model in his article entitled "The Effect of Foreign Trade on the Distribution of Income." But the article went unnoticed for over 10 years. After that, Professor Ohlin, another Swedish economist and also former student of Heckscher, picked up the article of Heckscher, worked on it, and clarified the matter in his famous book titled Inter-Regional and International Trade in the year 1933. Accordingly, the theorem is called Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. Now, what is the main content of Heckscher-Ohlin theorem? This theory states that one country will export those goods that are intensive in its abundant factor and import those goods that are intensive in its scarce factors. Now, we can understand this theory with the help of a simple example. Suppose there are two countries, country A and country B, and we assume there are two factors, labor and capital, and two commodities, commodity X and commodity Y, that are produced by the two countries. Now we also assume that commodity X is labor intensive commodity and commodity Y is capital intensive commodity. Now, according to Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, country A will export commodity X. Why? Because commodity X is labor intensive good and country A is labor abundant country. On the other hand, if we assume country B is capital abundant country and commodity Y is capital intensive good, then what we get from this theorem? We get that country B will export commodity Y because it is intensive in capital, which is the abundant factor of country B. In connection with the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, the most important question that arises is relative to the concept of factor intensity or factor abundance. Now, what is meant by factor abundance? Now, there are two ways to clarify the concept of factor abundance. One is physical definition of factor abundance and another one is price definition of factor abundance. First, we consider the physical definition of factor abundance. Now, this can be explained with the help of some notations that are mentioned here. Suppose L suffix A, this stands for the labor endowment level in country A, and Ka denotes capital endowment level in country A. Similarly, LB denotes the labor endowment level in country B and KB denotes the capital endowment level in country B. Now, if the labor capital ratio in country A, in notation LA by KA, is greater than the labor capital ratio in country B, in notation that is LB by KB, then it can be concluded that country A is labor abundant country, whereas country B is capital abundant country. Now, if we consider price definition of factor abundance, then we need to consider prices of the two factors labor and capital. Again, we assume PLA stands for the price of labor in country A and PKA denotes price of capital in country A. On the other hand, PLB denotes price of labor in country B, whereas PKB denotes price of capital in country B. Now, if the ratio of price of labor to the price of capital in country A is less than the ratio of price of labor to price of capital in country B, in notation that is PLA by PKA is less than PLB by PKB, then it can be concluded that country A is labor abundant or labor rich country and country B is capital abundant or capital rich country. Now, there is a problem in considering the price definition of factor abundance. Now, what is the problem? Usually, factor prices are influenced not only by the supply of the factor. There are several factors that influence price of any factor or any commodity. Now, market prices do not always denote the true abundance or true scarcity of factors. Therefore, a problem arises if we consider the factor price definition of factor abundance. Therefore, price definition of factor abundance is not considered generally to explain the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, and generally we consider the physical definition of factor abundance to explain the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. Now, we considered the assumptions of Heckscher-Ohlin model on the basis of which the model is developed. First, it is considered that there are two countries, two commodities and two factors in this model. Suppose the two countries are country A and country B. Two factors are labor and capital and two commodities are X and Y. Secondly, it is assumed that both the countries use the same technology in production. That means if X is labor-intensive commodity, it is labor-intensive in both the countries. It is not that commodity X is labor-intensive in country A and it is capital-intensive in country B. In Heckscher-Ohlin model, it is assumed that commodity X is labor-intensive in both the countries and commodity Y is capital-intensive in both the countries. Both countries use same technology implies that if factor prices were same in both the countries, then the two commodities and the two countries will produce the two commodities with the help of same factor ratio. Since factor prices usually differ, producers in each country will use more of that factor that is relatively cheaper in that country. Now both commodities are produced under constant returns to scale. It implies that if country A increases both labor and capital by 10%, suppose, then commodity X will also rise by 10%. That means if all the factors are doubled, then output will also double. This is the implication of constant returns to scale. Next, it is assumed that there is incomplete specialization after trade. That means even in after trade situation, both the countries will continue to produce both the commodities. It implies that two countries are not very small. Next assumption, there is perfect competition in both commodity and factor markets. Now, perfect competition implies that in the long run, price is just equal to the unit cost of production. That means there is no scope of economic profit in long run equilibrium. And in perfect competition, each market participant is a price taker. No one can influence the price of any commodity or any factor in the market. Next, it is assumed in Heckscher-Ohlin model that factors are completely mobile between the two sectors of any economy. It implies that the factor prices will be same in all the sectors in one economy. Next, it is assumed that factors are completely immobile across countries. So there exists inter-country factor price differences due to immobility of factors. Next, it is assumed that there are no transportation costs, tariffs, or other obstructions to the free flow of international trade. It is also assumed that all the resources are fully employed in production processes. So, there is no unused resources in any economy. Next, it is assumed that international trade is balanced. That means at equilibrium, the value of exports of any country is just equal to the value of imports of that country. Next, we shall consider what is the role of demand in this Heckscher-Ohlin model. If physical definition of factor abundance is adopted, then there arises a problem. Now, this can be explained with the help of a diagram. Let us consider this diagram. Here we have drawn two production possibility frontiers. AA prime is the production possibility frontier of country A and BB prime is the production possibility frontier of country B. Now here we see that production possibility frontier or PPF of country A is tilted towards the x-axis. Now we have measured here commodity X along x-axis and commodity Y along the y-axis. Now our assumption is country A is labor rich or labor abundant country and commodity X is labor intensive good. So here the horizontal intercept of country A's PPF is greater than the vertical intercept. Again, we see that the vertical intercept of country B's PPF is greater than the horizontal intercept of country B's PPF. This is just because of our assumption country B is capital rich country and commodity Y is capital abundant good. So, country B produces more of commodity Y than commodity X. Now, we have drawn one ray through the origin and it has cut the country A's PPF at point EA and country B's PPF at point EB. Now here we consider these 2 points EA and EB are the production points in no trade situation, that is under autarky. Now if we consider the price line that passes through point EA, we see that this is flatter. This price line is PAPA, and the price line passing through point EB is PBPB, and that is relatively steeper. So here we see that under autarky, the relative price of X is in country A is less than the relative price of commodity X in country B under autarky. So this may show that the country A will export commodity X and country B will export commodity Y. But if we consider the demand pattern, then it may not be the case. Here we see that the residents of country A prefers to consume more of commodity X, in which it has comparative advantage. So here we see the indifference map of country A is more closer to the x-axis. You see the indifference curves are IA, IA prime. Now, consumption equilibrium point is achieved where the price line is tangent with the highest possible indifference curve, and this is attained at a point EA prime. So here EA prime is the equilibrium point under autarky. Now the price line passing through EA prime shows that this is relatively steeper. So relative price of X is relatively higher in country A if we consider the demand pattern. Similarly, here the residents of country Y prefers to consume more commodity Y. That means the residents of country B prefers that commodity in which country B has comparative advantage. Therefore, the indifference map of country B is tilted towards y-axis, and we know the equilibrium point is attained where the indifference curve, highest possible indifference curve, is tangent with PPF, and it is attained at EB prime point. So the price line passing through this EB prime point, that is PB prime, is relatively flatter. So here we see the relative price of X is lower. That means relative price of Y is higher in country B. So here country A will not be interested to export commodity X, and country B will not be interested to export commodity Y. So here we see that Heckscher-Ohlin theorem does not hold good due to this demand pattern. Here we see that residents of each country prefer that commodity in which the country has comparative advantage, and this outweighs the production bias, and therefore the country is not interested to export that commodity in which it has comparative advantage. So here we see how the model is violated due to the demand factor. Next, we consider two additional assumptions that are proposed by Professor Samuelson to overcome this problem. Now the additional assumptions are: it is assumed commodities X and Y are preferred in the same way in both the countries. That means both the countries face the same indifference map. Secondly, it is assumed that the preference pattern is homothetic in nature. That means the demand pattern is not only same across countries, it is also same across income levels. So if the consumption levels of two commodities are raised by same proportion, then the value of marginal rate of substitution will remain same. Now this can be explained with the help of diagram, where we shall try to prove Heckscher-Ohlin theorem with these two additional assumptions. In this figure, we have drawn one set of IC for the two countries, as we have assumed now that the two countries prefer the two commodities in the same way. Here we have drawn two indifference curves, I0 and I1. I0 indifference curve is tangent with the PPF of country A at point EA, and I1 indifference curve is tangent with the BB prime PPF, that is PPF of country B at point EB. So these are the two equilibrium points under autarky in two countries. Now we have drawn one ray through the origin OF that cuts country A's PPF at point EA, that is the autarkic equilibrium point of country A, and it cuts I1 indifference curve at point M. Now, following the second additional assumption, that is demand pattern is homothetic, the slope of I0 indifference curve at EA is same with the slope of I1 IC at M. Now, we see that EB point and M point, they lie on the same indifference curve I1, and point M lies rightward to point EB. So, due to the law of diminishing marginal rate of substitution, slope of I1 IC at point M is less than the slope of the IC at point EB. Now, if we compare the slopes of the two ICs at points EA and point EB, then we find that slope of I0 IC at point EA is less than the slope of I1 IC at point EB. What is the reason? Just because slope of I0 IC EA is just equal to the slope of I1 IC at point M due to the second additional assumption, and due to the law of diminishing marginal rate of substitution, we see that slope of the I1 IC at point M is less than slope of I1 IC at point EB. So, combining these two, we get slope of I0 IC at point EA is less than slope of I1 IC at point EB. So, from here we get that the relative price of X commodity in country A is less in country A than relative price of commodity X in country B. So, here country A will be interested to export commodity X, and country B will be interested to export commodity Y, and this proves our Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. So we find that with the help of the two more assumptions as proposed by Professor Samuelson, Heckscher-Ohlin theorem can be proved. Now we see that there are exceptional cases where we get or we can prove Heckscher-Ohlin model without the help of the additional assumptions. In this case, look at the figure 3. Here we find that same indifference curve is tangent with the two production possibility frontiers of the two countries. Here the single indifference curve is II prime, and that is tangent with country A's PPF at point EA, and that is tangent with country B's PPF at point EB. So here we have considered the first additional assumption that the residents of the two countries prefer to consume the two commodities in same way. So only one indifference curve is drawn for the two countries, but as the two equilibrium points EA and EB lie on the same indifference curve, we can directly compare the slopes at point EA and at point EB. As EA lies rightward to point EB, so slope of the IC at point EA is less than slope of the IC at point EB. So from here we can conclude that country A will export commodity X just because relative price of X is less under autarky in country A and relative price of X is higher in country B under autarky. So country B will be interested to export commodity Y. So here we need not assume the second additional assumption. And if we consider another special case, here we find that the demand pattern in the two countries is such that the residents of each country prefer to consume that commodity which is intensive in its scarce factor. That means the consumers like to consume that commodity in which the country has comparative disadvantage. Look at this figure. In figure 4, we find that the indifference curves of country A is tilted towards y-axis. That means here the residents of country A prefer to consume more commodity Y, in which country A has comparative disadvantage. Therefore, here equilibrium is established at point EA, where the highest possible indifference curve is tangent with PPF at point EA. At this point, we see that the price line is flatter. So here relative price of X is less compared to other country, where we find the indifference curves are tilted towards x-axis in country B. That means residents of country B prefer to consume more of commodity X, that is the commodity in which country B has comparative disadvantage. So here we find the highest possible indifference curve IB prime is tangent with country B's PPF at point EB. So the price line passing through point EB is relatively steeper. That means here the relative price of X is higher. So here we find that country B will be interested to export commodity Y and import commodity B, which we get from Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. So here also we can prove or we can establish the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem without the two additional assumptions. None of the additional assumption is needed to be considered here to establish the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. So in this session we find that how the role of demand can violate the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. Thank you.